All right, so my name is Kenny Johnston. I'm here with Jason talking about how GitOps and infrastructure as code and continuous delivery relate to each other. Just so as a bit of background, GitLab is launching a GitOps focused use case around the GitOps model. And Jason and I were talking about how we have two separate teams that are working on potentially similar work, one in infrastructure as code in our configure group and one on continuous delivery in our progressive delivery group. So
yeah, exactly. And there was actually also just another really nice video that was recorded and posted from the folks who are working on that use case, talking about GitOps and all the different elements to it, which is another really interesting video to watch if you're interested in the topic. Yeah, so what I was thinking is, and it's the way that William actually introduced it on that video, is that the infrastructure as code has been developing and is getting some great tools. GitOps is meant to be an evolution on top of that, where you say like, hey, you know, what if you checked all of that into source control and then it was automatically deployed to your environments and it was kept in sync? And the way he described it was, it's essentially taking a lot of the lessons of continuous delivery of software applications and applying that to the infrastructure as code advancements that have been made, which makes a ton of sense. The way that us and not just us, but the market is talking about GitOps these days is really infrastructure as code focused. So they're like talking to operations people who are thinking about these kinds of problems. And what I've been noticing and what I was hoping to try and get people thinking about is that I think there's actually a convergence beyond this initial step coming where infrastructure as code will be more and more automated and will be replicated out to environments and provisioned and everything based on the state that's held in Git. I think that application deployments will also be moving in that same direction, and in many ways already are already there, but I think there are also innovations happening on the GitOps side that could then be brought back. And so the idea is that that we can get ourselves ahead of the game a little bit by potentially thinking about these things as eventually going to converge and already building something that treats infrastructure and the code that goes to that infrastructure as sort of a bundle that can be delivered together as part of your continuous delivery process. And so right now, it's not that we're intentionally building two different solutions or anything like that, but I just see kind of like similar discussions happening in two different areas that it feels like would be really, really interesting to have as a common discussion and talk about, you know, like, wow, what would it look like in 3 years if these do converge? And is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Is there anything we're not thinking about? And I just thought it would be really interesting to have those discussions. And that I guess the other element is that even if the technologies don't converge and somehow remain separate, deployments or releases that are managing a deployment are always going to include some element of code and some element of the application deployment. And I really strongly think that line will get more and more blurred as, you know, applications are deploying virtual infrastructure for themselves rather than having another team that's handling it. And it just kind of like all is rolling together through the environments. And
okay, so
provision.
Yeah, and that I'll share with you one of the things I heard at DOS. I attended a talk about Terraform usage, and the speaker was talking about how he was applying the same 12-factor app principles that you apply to an app to allow it to be bundled into a microservice and more progressively delivered to infrastructure as code. So I do see like that your point about them solidifying makes sense. Well, I guess one way you could think about that is infrastructure just another programming language or digital artifact that can go through the same CI/CD process as anything else? And I think the answer is becoming more and more yes. That's part of the principle of like a CI/CD based infrastructure as code, where you are consistently deploying changes in a push fashion to your infrastructure. I wonder how much of what you're suggesting is maybe about adopting the mindset of pull-based for your application itself too. Like instead of thinking of progressive delivery, it's more the pull-based delivery system rather than our
that was what I was kind of hinting at when I was talking about there's innovations happening on the infrastructure delivery side that could potentially be brought back. And that's specifically what I was thinking of, is like maybe, pull-based software delivery as well is really kind of, because if pull-based is better for deploying your infrastructure, it's going to also be better for
Right.
deploying software because you get the same benefits. They talk about security benefits. They talk about consistency and everything. And
Yeah.
those benefit application deployments as well.
And we typically think about those things like one of the benefits of the pull-based is the immutability. And let me like describe this historical perspective. Like it used to be that you handed your application over a wall to an ops team. And so there was a sense of immutability because the ops team was never going to muck with your application code.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're moving to this DevOps world where someone could muck with your application in production, and having the pull-based model completely prevents that, that you're always going to be checking the repo for the current state. So that does seem like, I don't hear that from customers or users, but a future problem as you adopt more and more of this, we're progressive delivering. Developers tend to be Git repo focused, so they're not going to go jump into the pod or container or virtual machine to adjust their application code. But I like that model. The other thing that you said that is interesting to me, and is not exactly how I think about it, is this like joint delivery. And so maybe it would help to walk through. The pattern we've seen in the configure stage is that the infrastructure definition is kind of owned, well, in larger organizations, is owned by a platform team that is supplying that platform to many applications. So the delivery rates could be completely different, right? You could adjust your platform, once a week, but be delivering new applications to that platform. And that disconnection is actually valuable because it means you're kind of providing a layer of abstraction for your developers that they can just ship, knowing that the platform will behave in the way they think it will behave. So that makes me less inclined to think of them as intertwined in we ship a release and it is both infrastructure and application changes.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think that's probably true, and a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is a little further ahead, where I'm imagining things might go. But I think already there's probably certain elements that platform team probably wants to just kind of say like, well, yes, it's more on the infrastructure side, but we're okay with engineering teams kind of provisioning these things themselves. So like static IP addresses or something like that. Maybe they're like, well, like let's hand that over, and we'll just say people can do that. Maybe VPCs will allow. Maybe other parts of the network provisioning will say like, yeah, you could put that in your application stack. Just define it there, and it makes sense. Don't worry about submitting a separate ticket to the platform team to make that for you. Go ahead and define that all in code. And I can imagine over, especially like if we're talking 3 years, that more and more of the stack will be able to be defined in software with the application itself.
Yeah.
And there will certainly still be some line, right? Like you won't in your application be able to like spin up a new data center or something like that. Sometimes it eventually becomes like a requirement for certain things you're building. But to a point that's further along than it is today, I can totally imagine that becoming part of and I don't even know what you'd call it, but it's like the app and infrastructure stack.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I totally agree, actually. I think we already see that today. Things like, the talk that we heard from at DOS was about different layers of I can't remember the exact terms, but they're like different layers of how they build up an application from an infrastructure perspective. And there are like base modules that are things like, include VPCs and node sizes and things like that you build up. But the end service is probably owned by that team that is like comprised of these different components. Or even think about it from a Kubernetes perspective, like if you were defining how many pods or some like redundancy, you would do that at your service level, and you employ the platform that's provided by the platform team, but they're still mungled together infrastructure and app code definition owned by that same team. So actually that makes total sense that, yeah, you're always going to want to be shipping them together. Does that mean that the approach of progressive delivery that we have is let me put it this way. Like you can think of technology changes as always evolving. And one of those steps is a necessary evolutionary step that every organization is going to pass through. Like we don't do any CD today, we do CD, we do some progressive delivery, then we do GitOps style application delivery, or is it GitOps style application delivery would supplant what we call CD style progressive delivery today?
That's actually a really super interesting question that needs to be explored. Like, I think it's a little too early to tell. In some ways, like off the top of my head, they're sort of, I guess, outside of the Venn diagram in two different parts of the Venn diagram, because they don't need to impact each other. But the part that was really interesting when you were talking, and I was like, wow, that's actually really interesting, is what would progressive delivery of infrastructure look like? And what if your application code, you're defining the infrastructure along with it. And so for this new feature, there's a new ingress point. So it needs a static IP address. And could you bundle that infrastructure with the code that delivers just that feature? And so like, as you're progressively rolling out that feature, it's doing the infrastructure provisioning that goes with it. I think probably yes, but how you would define that could be pretty tricky. But it's a really interesting thought that things could evolve that way. In which case, then you end up going through both. Both of them, I think, I have more exposure and more career history on the progressive delivery side. So for me, that feels like a thing that everyone's going to go through more than the other.
Yeah.
But GitOps is also really interesting. I just don't know yet whether everyone will use GitOps, or if it's kind of certain environments.
Yeah, and one of it might be, and I'm thinking of the GitOps, the distinction between the two as push versus pull, and I'd rather use those terms than like, because I think you can do progressive delivery while still doing GitOps in the sense that like I'm progressively rolling out my change.
You could, yes, you can definitely do progressive delivery in a pull fashion.
Yeah.
And that's no problem.
And so that's what I'm suggesting is the pull fashion going to be the like just preferred method as opposed to it being a stopover. And the thing that I'm stuck on is I think that the pull fashion works really well with Kubernetes style applications and container-based applications, but you can still do progressive delivery with, traditional virtual machine style deployments. And so if you have not migrated to cloud native, you would not even have the option of doing pull-based typically.
Yeah, I think there's two threads here that actually are pretty independent from each other. One, and it's pull and push deployments. And GitOps in theory is always pull-based, pull-based, but I think you can also potentially have Git be the source of truth and still do pushes in certain ways. And then, so that's one track, is a decision around whether we go through pull and push and how that works. But then the other interesting one is whether the application and code deployment are one thing or two in the end. And both of those, I think, can be considered separately, but also interact in interesting ways.
Yeah, and I think, couldn't we support the two of them in separate repos, but the same thing in that they would have some dependency between the two of them today? Like if I had a application repo and an infrastructure repo, I could say, whenever you're deploying new infrastructure, you would also need to redeploy the app back on top of it or something like that.
Yeah, you could. In the same way that you could put like the front end of your app in one project and the back end of your app in another project. It's always going to be somewhat simpler in the end if you can get everything into one repo for your atomic unit. But yeah, that's not always possible. And it depends on the organizational structure as well. If you got separate teams, that makes more sense. But if it really is in the future, one engineering team who's defining the infrastructure and writing the code, they're probably just going to work in one repo.
Yeah. Okay. And then maybe there's that. So I keep thinking about this platform team concept, but maybe there's a separate platform team, maybe there's not. But at the end, you would want to define it as close to the repo.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the things on this side of the platform team as well. So wherever that line is cut in the future, where it's not part of the core platform, but it's something they expose to the engineering teams to be able to provision, but is still infrastructure.
Yeah. What's the you highlighted those as, I can't remember the word, threats. What do you, can you add some more color to what you perceive as the threat to GitLab, or like where we're deficient or potentially not ahead?
No, I have threads.
Threads. Okay, I thought you
Yeah,
said
yeah.
threats. Okay.
There are two different topics I think that can be discussed,
Okay.
not threats to us. In fact, I think the reason I'm thinking about this stuff is because I think that there isn't anybody else, and there isn't any other product that's got these really nicely meshed together in a way, and we have an opportunity to potentially build something really cool that that doesn't force people to put it into boxes. That was sort of what I was imagining as the bad future, where you know, in 2 years we kind of look back and we're like, oh cool, you know, we've got a really nice infrastructure as code deployment tool built into the product, and a really nice software deployment tool built into the product, and you know, we make them work together nicely in the single application, but someone else will then come out with like, here's one where they're just the same thing, and
Yeah,
it will
exactly.
be a first class support for that, and it will be better.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, like the interesting thing is our current capabilities and direction in the infrastructure as code is very, you can combine what we're doing with Terraform, for example. You can combine Terraform with an application code in a single directory, and you could use parent-child pipelines to deploy them separately. You can use the merge request widget. That is still push-based. Our future Kubernetes agent is going to be pull-based, but you could utilize that for both pulling changes to the Kubernetes cluster definition itself, as well as changes to the application. I think it's
Exactly,
primarily
yeah.
for changes to the application.
And that was another I think bad outcome, or at least not ideal outcome, where you're sort of, eventually these things kind of converge, and we have two solutions, and you're like, yeah, you can use our configure solution to do your app and code and infrastructure deployment, or you could use our CD solution to do your app and infrastructure deployment, and it just creates a decision to be made at the beginning for somebody who's like, oh gosh, which one do I pick? You know.
Yeah.
Uh,
I guess I would think of that as you would be deciding push versus pull, but we should be prescriptive about, here's the places where we think you should be doing pull, and
and
universally.
maybe that is like maybe that's a more logical. I don't. What you just said has not been kind of like formalized and agreed upon, that's like what these teams' roles are. So maybe that's a potential outcome where it starts to make more sense.
Yeah, it's weird because the configure team is working on both push and pull in different contexts. One when deploying infrastructure as code in that category for things like Terraform, and then it would be pull for Kubernetes, which is, yeah, there's a little bit of murkiness in my head there. But I think
CD, to be honest, there's deployment modes for CD where you set up it's Kubernetes also, but where you set up Kubernetes to monitor for an image, and if you can have it monitor for a tag, and so if you're just updating the same tag with like a tag named production or something like that, then Kubernetes will pull that whenever that image is updated. And so like in the auto deploy Kubernetes deployment, you can set things up that way, and that's owned by the CD team, and that's a pull model. Or you can use our ECS deployment, which is like it will push whenever things go out. And so both have both right now.
Yeah, gotcha.
It will
Okay.
continue to evolve.
So the two threads we said were push versus pull, and remind me the second one.
The second one was whether or not infrastructure and code will kind of just like, there'll be one file that defines them both. Kind of like Terraform is today. Like you can put code and infrastructure in your Terraform definition, and it will deploy everything. So if that becomes a model, then
yeah, and I was thinking like one desirable outcome, I guess, would be us having a prescriptive idea for our users, like independent of how we organize and make sure we're clarifying as teams, but for our users, I think push versus pull is a like, when should you use either? And we should be prescriptive about when we think one should be used or the other as we evolve more pull-based methods. then the other one, when it comes to apps and infrastructure, it's more, is it our recommendation that those should be tied together? And if so, then we will hopefully build an experience that is not disjointed as a result, versus is it our recommendation that they shouldn't? And if we can come up with those two kind of like sets of conventions that we want to suggest to our users, then I think that will help our teams align on who's covering what and making sure that we have that kind of like goalpost in mind.
Yeah. And it's all pretty nascent, so it's not like we, it's not an emergency decision, but it would be really great to have everybody thinking about this stuff already and kind of talking about it. I think it would help guide us to an interesting place, better place.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Calling out that it's nascent means we can't just say like, go ask 5 practitioners. One of the things that Victor highlighted to me is like, you go ask 5 practitioners for the best Terraform flow, and you'll get typically 5 different answers. There's starting to become some coalescing, but I do think it would behoove us to investigate what we think is our current convention, and I guess we can change that convention over time, but as long as we all agree on what the current convention is, it would help. Cool. I think this video is great. Hopefully others will watch it and we can continue the dialogue.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Kenny.
Okay. Thanks, Jason.